All right, we only have a few more things to do before we're done with all the content for the semester. Just like we introduced international economics, you can take a lot of classes on that. There are also a lot of classes you can take on public economics, political economy, and environmental economics that can get very deep and interesting and complex. So we just sort of introduce each of those just like we introduced international economics, give sort of a bird's eye view of it. And they're important. Obviously, international economics are important, but these are important fields as well because, well, think about what we've looked at in this class. We have a market structure like perfect competition where everything is just so nice. Um, it, Everybody gets exactly as much as they want, so long as they're willing to pay for it, and the production side of the economy makes as much as people are willing to pay for. The marginal benefit to society is exactly equal to the marginal cost. We don't get too much production, we don't get too little. And the people who use goods and services are completely willing to pay all of the costs of producing them. But we also said that that's a very unrealistic market structure because it is. Not only because sometimes there can be barriers to entry that reduce competition, but because there are also plenty of scenarios where we don't have full, perfect information. And of course, there are externalities, like in this slide, um, which means that someone who's not party to a given transaction is not, they're still being hurt by it or they're still benefiting from it. We'll see a couple of examples of that, but externalities exist in a lot of activities, which complicates the picture, the perfect competition picture. And of course, every other market structure results in underproduction and prices that are a little too high if they don't end up with the perfect competition outcome, as in the case with oligopoly. There are also scenarios where we wouldn't expect private individuals to provide various goods and services, but people still need them or at least want them. So we cover that with public goods. But first, we're going to talk about externalities. So an externality is not just a good or bad thing that comes from a production process or the consumption of a good or service. It's all about whether if you buy something, then any costs to consuming that product is not an externality. You are internalizing it. And any benefits, again, it's not an externality. If you are the producer, then again, you don't experience any externalities. You pay the cost of production and then you get the benefit of receiving payment when you sell the good or service. An externality has to do with somebody else. So if you live near a concert hall, a big outdoor concert space, and you don't like the music being played there, then you get a negative externality when other people pay to consume the production of a concert. But you also get a positive externality if you do like the music. So you have nothing to do with it. You're not producing the music. You're not getting paid for it. You're not paying for it. You just live nearby. So that's what an externality is. So it kind of throws off a lot of our decision making. Remember, when we make decisions, it's all about marginal benefit and marginal cost. If marginal benefit is greater than marginal cost, then you need to scale things back a little bit. And of course, if marginal benefit is less than marginal cost, then you need to do more. So we define something called an external marginal cost, which is the marginal cost imposed on a person who is not involved in the production of a good or service. Pollution is maybe the most obvious and prominent example. If you produce something, you're making something that somebody else wants, you're not necessarily dealing with the pollution, but somebody else might be if they have to breathe the air or if you're polluting a water source or something like that. So we have something called the social marginal cost, which is where we take the private marginal cost, which we've been looking at all semester, and we add on to that any costs that are going to be imposed on other people. And we define that as our social marginal cost, the marginal cost to everyone in society, whether they are the actual producer of a good or service or whether they have nothing to do with it. So we can take the thing that we're used to where we want a marginal benefit that's equal to marginal cost, and we instead say that we want a production rule where the marginal benefit is going to be equal to the social marginal cost. And same thing with the marginal benefits. If somebody benefits from something like good music being played at that music hall, well, there's an external marginal benefit, and vaccines are another example. If you consume a vaccine, then other people benefit because they're not as likely to get sick with the same thing. And this is a case where we might have underconsumption. We want more people to consume the vaccines, but because people aren't receiving the benefit, they're not necessarily going to pay a higher price, and other people aren't willing to pay whatever price you have to pay to buy a vaccine. So we would have underconsumption of vaccines. So we have the same kind of thing on the marginal benefit side. The marginal benefit for all of society is going to combine the private marginal benefit that's going to determine what range of prices you're willing to pay for something, and you combine it with the external marginal benefit so we can figure out how much other people might be willing to pay for you to enjoy the benefits of consumption. And we combine these together in the same way, and then we can, of course, take both and put them together at the same time to get a decision rule where we want the social marginal benefit of a good or service being produced and consumed to be equal to the social marginal cost. So it can get really complicated, but it all boils down to just this simple rule and simple scenario. Social marginal benefit equals social marginal cost. So we can graph this out on a supply-demand model, again, by defining positive externalities or negative externalities, and then we can distinguish between the private demand curve, which we're familiar with, and a social demand curve, where we have all of society now saying, we want you to consume more or less of this good or service. So in the case of a positive externality, the supply-demand model we've been looking at, where all the costs and benefits are completely internalized by the people involved in the market and there are no externalities, that's going to be this demand curve and this supply curve. But once we factor in the positive externalities, the social demand curve includes everybody here, but also people out here who want more consumption of this good or service. So it has the same effect as the demand curve shifting to the right. So the optimal for society is to have a higher quantity, but we're also going to have a higher price. Again, the old expression, no free lunch in economics. If you want more of something good, then one does have to pay a higher price. And there are various ways this can happen through taxation and subsidies and so on, or just a private individual saying, here, let me give you some money so that you can afford more of whatever it is I want you to consume. So our new equilibrium has higher quantities and prices. And we can look at the same thing with the supply curve. Here we have a negative externality in supply in this example. So we distinguish between the social supply curve and the private supply curve that we've been looking at. So again, this is the familiar picture to us, the private supply and the private demand with no externalities. But if there's a negative externality in production, it's the consumption of the product isn't the problem here. Now it's production of the product, again, pollution being the main example. Then we're going to want higher prices and lower quantity, which is the new equilibrium we have. Higher prices to discourage consumption that would lead to less production, and then of course a lower amount of production gets us to that optimal amount. So it's is an interesting result that comes out of environmental economics. When we hear people talk about environmentalism, typically people will say pollution is bad, and so we think we want zero pollution. But you think about where pollution comes from, it's not that people want to pollute. It's not even always that people don't care whether they pollute or not, though that may apply. At the end of the day, if we don't pollute at all, then we have zero production. If we have zero production, then nobody has anything. Everybody starves, everybody's out in the cold. It's a much worse world to live in than one with a little pollution. So the optimal amount of pollution is actually not zero. That might be our knee-jerk reaction, but the optimal amount of solution goes back to this decision rule, the marginal benefit of reducing pollution versus the marginal cost of reducing pollution. The marginal cost of reducing pollution means less output, higher prices, it's harder for the poor, etc., etc. The marginal benefits, well, we already know those pretty well. So, an example here, you could just forget about it, not reduce any pollution. There's no benefit to not reducing pollution, but it's also a costless way of doing things. Or we can reduce 5% of our pollution. Think about a firm that is looking at, we may want to try to get a firm from the government level or something like that to reduce their pollution through taxes, mandates, whatever. And we're looking at doing it in a way that isn't going to be too costly for society. So if we look at, maybe we can, if they reduce pollution by 5%, this will be the benefit to society, this will be the cost, these are the total benefits and costs. 20% would be great reduction, the benefit there would be 26. Total benefits keep rising, sometimes we can put a dollar sign on it. But the total costs also keep rising. So what's the best trade-off? We want less pollution, obviously, but we don't want less production, fewer goods and services, more starvation, etc. So if we calculate the marginal benefits and marginal costs somewhere between 5 and 10%, where the marginal benefit of pollution abatement of 5% exceeds the marginal cost, so definitely do that. Once you get up to 10%, that's where you start hitting that point where they're just about equal, and jumping from 10 to 15, now your marginal benefit is lower than your marginal. You have more starvation and so on with just a little bit more pollution abatement. So we want to hit that sweet spot that we've been looking for all semester. Marginal benefit equals marginal cost, and that's where we get our optimal pollution amount. So this is a much deeper issue. There's a lot more to go into. In past classes, I've gone over tradable pollution permits as a more efficient way of trying to reduce pollution given the different cost structures of different firms. But we're up against the end of the semester. That's something that is poorly understood anyway at this level, so it's definitely worth checking out in an environmental econ class. But we're going to leave it here, and in the next video get into public goods.